Listen carefully because this was never meant to be heard. In 1857, in a place maps tried to forget, men gathered every Sunday not to worship, but to be emptied. Black Hollow didn't ring with church bells. It swallowed sound. No hymns echoed from its chapel, no laughter from its pews. Just silence. Heavy, intentional. The kind of silence designed to make a man doubt his own thoughts. They called themselves congregants, but they never spoke during service. Not a word, not even prayer. The preacher would enter without greeting, face hidden beneath shadow, and stand for 8 full minutes without moving. Those first 8 minutes were not dead time. They were the ritual. Because when a man is forced to sit with nothing but his own breathing, his mind becomes soft, suggestible, ready. Black Hollow sat beyond the coal roads, beyond the reach of ordinary law. Official records describe it as a spiritual settlement. Unofficial letters, those later seized and buried in state archives, used a different phrase, behavioral correction enclave. This was not a church that preached salvation. It engineered obedience. Here's the part they never taught you about faith. Fear is more efficient than belief. Belief asks questions. Fear obeys. The men who entered Black Hollow came broken. War veterans, widowers, displaced laborers, men who had lost social footing in a rapidly industrializing America. The institution promised restoration, purpose, order, but what it delivered was something else entirely. A system designed to hollow a man out, then refill him with doctrine so deeply embedded he would defend it as his own idea. And the silence? That was the key. Silence is not absence. Silence is pressure. Prolonged silence disrupts internal narration. It fractures identity. After weeks without communal speech, the congregants began reporting the same symptoms. Intrusive guilt, sudden loyalty to authority, fear of independent thought, confession without sin, submission without command. This wasn't accidental. It was studied. Black Hollow's founders were not simple men of God. They were readers of banned European manuscripts, treatises on mass psychology, early crowd control theology, and something more ancient. Techniques traced back to mystery cults, where initiates were stripped of language before being reborn into truth. A man without words is a man without resistance. You were told institutions exist to guide you, protect you, civilize you. But Black Hollow exposes a darker function, to shape you quietly, efficiently, and permanently, while convincing you it was your choice. And this is only the outer door, because once the silence took hold, the real doctrine began. Once the silence rewired them, Black Hollow introduced its second instrument, controlled revelation. The men believed they were being taught ancient truths, but in reality, truth was rationed like a drug. You see, power doesn't come from knowledge alone. It comes from deciding who gets access to it and when. After 3 weeks of enforced quiet, the congregants were finally allowed to hear a voice. Not a conversation, no discussion, just a reading. One passage, repeated every morning. Always the same words, always the same cadence. The human brain is not designed to question repetition delivered with authority. It begins to accept rhythm as truth. The passage spoke of inherent human corruption. That man, left to himself, is dangerous. That freedom is a disease masquerading as virtue. And that only submission to a higher structure, never clearly defined, could keep chaos at bay. Notice the trick. There was no named enemy, no clear God, just an undefined threat and an undefined savior. This creates dependency without accountability. Men began policing their own thoughts. Journals recovered decades later reveal something chilling. Congregants started writing apologies for ideas they never expressed. Some begged forgiveness for imagining dissent. Others confessed to doubting the silence itself. This is what psychological capture looks like when it's working properly. The institution no longer needs guards. The mind becomes the prison. Black Hollow's leadership understood something most systems still rely on today. Fear is strongest when it is vague. A visible tyrant can be resisted. An invisible one becomes internal. The congregants weren't afraid of punishment. They were afraid of being wrong, afraid of losing alignment, afraid of stepping outside a truth they could never fully see. And then came the testimonies. Once a week, one man would be selected to stand and speak. The others were forbidden to respond. No nodding, no reaction, not even eye contact. The speaker would recount how his former life was filled with arrogance, selfishness, and illusion. He would thank Black Hollow for stripping him down, for correcting him, for saving him from himself. But here's what the records reveal. Those testimonies were edited, rehearsed, corrected line by line. Men who deviated from the approved narrative were returned to silence for months. Some never spoke again. This wasn't faith. It was narrative enforcement. Black Hollow wasn't building believers. It was manufacturing a specific type of man. Obedient, guilty, dependent on structure. A man who confuses submission with strength and calls it virtue. And if you're paying attention, you'll feel the discomfort now. Because this pattern didn't die in 1857. It was refined, systematized, exported. Black Hollow was not an isolated experiment. It was a prototype. And what came next proved just how far they were willing to go. After language was narrowed and thought disciplined, Black Hollow moved to its most dangerous phase, identity replacement. This is the moment where a man stops asking, "Who am I?" and begins asking, "What am I allowed to be?" Names were the first to go, not officially. There was no announcement, no decree. The preacher simply stopped using them. Congregants were referred to only by function: the listener, the witness, the penitent. At first, it seemed symbolic, humble, spiritual, but the effect was surgical. A name anchors memory. Erase it, and the past loses gravity. Within months, men stopped writing their given names in journals. Some scratched them out. Others replaced them with symbols: a hollow circle, a cross without arms, a single vertical line. Identity was being reduced to geometry. Simple, interchangeable, safe. The leadership understood a brutal truth. Individuality is expensive to maintain. It requires memory, context, and contradiction. Strip those away, and what remains is compliance dressed as peace. Then came the mirror fasts. 4 days at a time, congregants were forbidden from seeing their own reflections. Polished metal was removed. Water basins were dulled. Even glass windows were smeared with ash. When men can no longer see themselves, they begin to rely on external affirmation to exist. The institution becomes the mirror. When reflections were finally reintroduced, they were controlled. A single mirror in the chapel's rear chamber. Dimly distorted. Men were brought in one by one and instructed to repeat a single phrase while staring into their warped image. "I am what I am shown to be." Psychologists would later describe this as guided dissociation. At Black Hollow, it was called humility. Something broke during those sessions. Letters describe men failing to recognize themselves, Others reported feeling watched from inside their own skulls. One man wrote that his reflection blinked out of sequence, as if lagging behind his thoughts. Whether it's a hallucination or a stress response doesn't matter. The outcome was the same. Internal authority collapsed, and into that vacuum stepped the doctrine. Black Hollow did not tell men what to think. That would invite resistance. Instead, it taught them how to feel when thinking independently. Fear, guilt, unease. Freedom became physically uncomfortable. Obedience felt warm, safe, correct. This is how control systems survive for generations. Not by force, but by emotional conditioning so deep the subject defends it as instinct. By the end of the first year, most congregants no longer spoke of before. Their past became abstract, dangerous, something to be purged rather than remembered. A man without a past is easy to aim at, and Black Hollow aimed them carefully, because beyond the chapel walls, the institution had begun serving a second purpose, one never written, never preached, but deeply understood by those in power. The men were being prepared, not for salvation, but for use. Preparation requires testing, and Black Hollow tested its men the way a blacksmith tests steel, by stress, by heat, by bending them just short of breaking. The first assignments seemed harmless. Congregants were sent beyond the hollow on errands of service. Deliver a message, observe a meeting, sit silently in a town square, and report nothing. No instructions beyond obedience. No explanation afterward. The purpose was not the task. It was the response. Men who asked why were quietly removed from the rotation. Not punished, not shamed, and excluded. In a closed system, exclusion is terror. To be unseen is to not exist. Those who complied were rewarded with proximity. A nod from the preacher, a longer gaze, a whispered sentence after service. Power does not need to shout. It only needs to be scarce. Soon, the errands escalated. Some men were instructed to lie convincingly to local officials. Others were asked to withhold information that could have prevented harm. One journal recounts a fire in a nearby settlement. A congregant knew it was coming. He had overheard it. He said nothing. Later, he wrote, "Silence felt righteous. Speaking felt like betrayal." That sentence should disturb you, because it reveals the inversion was complete. Moral instinct had been replaced with institutional loyalty. Good and evil were no longer internal judgments. They were permissions. Black Hollow justified this with doctrine. The world beyond was described as diseased, corrupt, too loud, too free. Intervention, they said, would interfere with a greater plan. Suffering was framed as purification. Distance became virtue. This is how systems turn men into instruments without ever calling them weapons. What the congregants didn't know, what they were never allowed to know, was that Black Hollow maintained correspondence with external authorities, industrial leaders, political strategists. Social engineers are fascinated by one question. Can belief be engineered at scale? The Hollow was their answer. Reports were exchanged under coded language. Congregants referred to as units. Emotional response is categorized. Compliance rates measured. This wasn't faith, it was field research. A living laboratory tucked into the American shadow. And here's the most unsettling part. The men chosen for higher proximity were not the strongest or the smartest. They were the emptiest, the ones who no longer reacted with anger or pride, the ones who felt nothing when denying themselves. Because a man who feels nothing can be aimed anywhere. By the time the congregants realized their service extended beyond the hollow, it was too late. Their identities had been flattened, their instincts rerouted. They could no longer tell the difference between conscience and command. And Black Hollow was ready to reveal its true expectation. Not devotion, execution. What they were about to be asked to do would permanently sever the last thread of their former selves. And once crossed, there would be no return. The final severance begins the moment a man is asked to act without a witness. No connivigation, no preacher, no affirmation, just a command delivered in silence. In the winter of 1858, select congregants were summoned individually after dusk. They were given sealed envelopes, no markings, no signatures. Inside was a single instruction, written in the same narrow hand used for scripture. Nothing else. No explanation, no justification, only an expectation. Some were told to destroy letters before they could be read, others to escort individuals to places they would not return from. A few were instructed to observe and do nothing while harm unfolded. The tasks varied, but the principle was identical. Will you obey when no one is watching? This is the point of no return in every control system. Because once a man violates his own moral boundary in private, the institution owns him in public. Guilt becomes the leash. Silence becomes survival. One recovered envelope instructed a congregant to mark a door with ash and walk away. The next morning, the house burned. Whether the marking caused it or merely identified the target no longer mattered. The man never spoke again. Not once. He remained at Black Hollow for 12 more years, tending the grounds with mechanical precision. When asked later why he stayed, he wrote only, "There is nothing left to leave with." This is how obedience is sealed, not through belief, but through irreversible action. Black Hollow referred to this stage as completion, a grotesque word. Completion implies wholeness. What it actually produced was vacancy. Men who had crossed the threshold no longer resisted. They no longer questioned. They no longer imagined alternatives. And that vacancy was valuable. External correspondence increased. The Hollow's leadership was praised for its results, for producing men who could be trusted with necessary acts. Acts that cannot be traced. Acts that required clean hands and silent minds. You were taught history moves through speeches and battles. But the real shifts happen quietly, carried out by men who believe they are nobody, doing things they will never speak of, in service of systems that will never claim them. Here is the truth buried under doctrine and time. Black Hollow did not fail. It succeeded beyond expectations, which is why it was eventually shut down. Not because it was abusive, not because it was cruel, but because it worked too well. The congregants were becoming invisible, untraceable, loyal to the culture over the nation, and that frightened the very authorities who had funded the experiment. When the closure order came, it was framed as scandal, misconduct, religious extremism. The public explanation was safe, shallow, forgettable. But the real reason was far more dangerous. Black Hollow had proven something no institution was ready to admit, that men could be rewritten completely, and that once rewritten, they could never truly be released. Because even after the gates closed, the silence did not. When Black Hollow was ordered to close, nothing ended. It dispersed. Officially, the chapel was condemned. Records were sealed. The preacher vanished without name or photograph. The congregants were reintegrated. That word appears again, soft, harmless, administrative. But reintegration assumes there is something left to integrate. There wasn't. The men left in small groups, spaced weeks apart, released into cities that were already learning to value order over truth. Factories, rail offices, municipal departments, quiet roles, trusted positions, jobs that required reliability, discretion, and emotional neutrality. No one noticed them because they were trained not to be noticed. They spoke little. They followed the procedure. They never challenged authority. And when systems asked for silence, they delivered it instinctively, without resentment, without hesitation. This is how Black Hollow survived, not as a place, but as a pattern. One former congregant became a clerk in a state records office. Years later, auditors noticed missing birth certificates, altered death dates, and erased land claims. No motive, no trail, just absence. Another took work as a prison chaplain. Inmates described him as calming, gentle, empty. Confessions increased after his visits. Appeals stopped. Black Hollow had not produced extremists. It had produced stabilizers, men who absorbed chaos and convert it into quiet compliance. This is the part of history you were never taught. Institutions don't collapse when exposed. They adapt by distributing their methods into the culture. What was once concentrated becomes normalized. What was once shocking becomes procedure. Silence became professionalism. Obedience became maturity. Emotional suppression became strength. And the men of Black Hollow blended in perfectly. Some married, some didn't. Some raised children with rigid calm and absolute certainty. No shouting, no worms, just rules that felt ancient and unquestionable. Sons raised in those homes later described an inherited unease, a sense that disagreement was dangerous even when unspoken. Trauma doesn't need stories to propagate. It only needs structure. By the 1890s, similar faith correction enclaves appeared under new names. Reformed sanctuaries, moral institutes, industrial chapels. None acknowledged Black Hollow. None needed to. The blueprint had already been tested. Strip language, disrupt identity, replace instinct with guilt, bind men through private violation, then release them back into the system as silent operators. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, it should, because the mechanism never disappeared. It simply shed its chapel. And here is where the descent deepens, because Black Hollow was not the origin. It was the American adaptation of something far older. Something that was understood centuries ago was how to turn belief into infrastructure. The Hollow's founders didn't invent the method. They rediscovered it. And in the next layer, you'll see where it truly came from and why it keeps resurfacing whenever power feels threatened. Once you see that pattern, you won't be able to unsee it. That is the danger. Long before Black Hollow, before America, before modern institutions learned to hide their teeth behind language, this method had a name, though it was never meant to be spoken aloud. In fragmented Latin manuscripts seized from dissolved monasteries, it appears as Vicita's Fidei, the hollowing of faith. Not devotion to God, but devotion to structure itself. The belief that order must be preserved even if meaning is destroyed in the process. The earliest traces lead back to ELV 8 Roman collapse, when empires realized something terrifying. Armies fail, laws rot, gods change, but disciplined minds endure. And so certain sects abandoned preaching entirely. They replaced revelation with ritual deprivation, silence, repetition, identity erosion. The same bones you now recognize in Black Hollow. These sects didn't want believers. They wanted carriers, men emptied of personal allegiance who could move between systems without resistance. Men who could enforce doctrine without believing in it. Men who would never rebel because rebellion requires an internal self to defend. Churches absorbed the method quietly. So did monarchies. So did emerging bureaucracies. Every time centralized power felt threatened by chaos, dissent, or awakening, the hollowing returned, under a new name, a new uniform, a new justification. What makes Black Hollow unique is not what it did. It's how openly it did it. Most institutions dilute the process across generations. Black Hollow compressed it into months. That's why it left such a deep psychic scar. That's why it had to be buried. But here's the part that should unsettle you most. The method does not require belief in God at all. It only requires fear of disorder, fear of uncertainty, fear of men who think independently. Faith was just a wrapper. The core mechanism is control through self-erasure. When you're taught that obedience is humility, you stop recognizing submission. When you're taught that silence is wisdom, you stop speaking the truth. When guilt replaces instinct, authority no longer needs to threaten you. You threaten yourself. The men of Black Hollow didn't feel enslaved. They felt correct. That is the most efficient prison ever designed. And this is why modern systems still flirt with the hollowing. Just enough to keep populations calm, productive, and manageable. Not enough to be noticed. Not enough to spark revolt. Just enough to dull the edge. You see it in institutions that punish curiosity while rewarding compliance. In cultures that call emotional numbness strength. In systems that label obedience as maturity and dissent as instability. Black Hollow wasn't a mistake. It was a test run, and the results were so effective that they had to be hidden inside everything else. Because a man who knows this pattern becomes dangerous, not violent, aware. And awareness is the one thing hollow systems cannot tolerate. The question is no longer whether Black Hollow still exists. The question is how much of it lives inside you without your permission. Here is where resistance usually fails, because the mind looks for villains wearing obvious masks. Dictators, cult leaders, fanatics. But Black Hollow teaches a harder truth. The most effective control systems feel reasonable, boring, sensible. They never announce themselves as prisons. They present as responsibility. By the late 19th century, language itself began shifting. Words once associated with submission were rebranded as virtues. Discipline, professionalism, stability, emotional restraint. Men were praised not for insight, but for reliability. Not for courage, but for predictability. This was not a coincidence. The hollowing method doesn't destroy masculinity. It redirects it. It takes a man's instinct to endure, to sacrifice, to commit, and binds it to structures that do not love him back. The man believes he is strong because he can tolerate emptiness. He believes he is mature because he feels nothing. Black Hollow understood this leverage point perfectly. Pain that is chosen feels meaningful. Pain that is imposed feels unjust. So the system trains men to choose their own suppression and call it virtue. Look closely at how silence is rewarded. The man who doesn't complain is promoted. The man who questions is labeled unstable. The man who internalizes conflict is called dependable. Over time, the lesson becomes muscle memory. My value comes from how little of myself I show. That is not a strength. That is preparation. Because a man who hides his inner signal can be inserted anywhere. He will endure moral contradictions. He will justify actions that violate instinct. He will remain calm while participating in systems that harm others. Because calmness has been framed as superiority. This is how entire populations drift without resistance. Not through chains, through posture. Black Hollow didn't train its congregants to be cruel. It trained them to be neutral. And neutrality, when structured, is devastating. A neutral man will allow almost anything if it is framed as necessary, procedural, or temporary. And here's the deepest cut. Once neutrality becomes identity, awakening feels like betrayal. To question the system feels like regressing, like becoming childish, emotional, dangerous. So men police themselves. They call unease weakness. They call intuition impulsiveness. They call silence control. This is the inheritance of Black Hollow, not as memory, but as atmosphere. You were never told to obey blindly. You were taught to distrust your inner voice. And that is far more effective, because a man who doubts himself will borrow certainty from institutions. He will trade freedom for reassurance. He will accept hollow peace over living tension. This is the point in the descent where most listeners want to pull away. To say this is exaggerated. This is symbolic. That impulse is the conditioning defending itself. Stay with the discomfort, because the next layer reveals why the hollowing doesn't just maintain systems. It selects leaders. And once you see who rises inside these structures and why, you'll understand why history keeps repeating itself under different flags, different faiths, different slogans. The descent is not over. It's just getting personal. Power does not fear chaos the way you were taught. Chaos is noisy, obvious, easy to point at. What power truly fears is uncontrolled clarity. Men who can see without needing permission, who act without waiting for approval, who cannot be guilted into obedience. That is why hollow systems don't elevate the strongest men. They elevate the emptiest. Inside institutions shaped by the Black Hollow pattern, leadership does not go to those with vision. It goes to those with alignment. Men who feel no internal resistance when enforcing contradiction. Men who can speak policy while disconnecting from consequence. Men whose identities are fused to role rather than truth. This is not accidental selection. It is filtration. Over time, men who still feel conflict self-removal. They burn out. They resign. They rebel and are labeled unstable. What remains is a narrow psychological type, calm under moral stress, loyal to structure, detached from outcome. These men are mistaken for disciplined. They are not. They are hollowed. Black Hollow discovered that when identity is erased, ambition changes shape. It no longer seeks meaning. It seeks a position. Advancement becomes a way to justify the emptiness. The higher the role, the more the void feels purposeful. And here's the trap. Once such a man reaches authority, he begins to replicate the system that produced him, not out of cruelty, but necessity. To question it would collapse the identity he sacrificed everything to maintain. So the pattern spreads upward. Policies harden. Language dulls. Humanity is replaced with procedure. Harm is reframed as efficiency. Distance becomes professionalism. And all of it feels clean, rational, inevitable. This is how institutions commit acts that no individual inside them would consciously choose. Not because of evil intent, but because responsibility has been dissolved into structure. Black Hollow didn't just train followers. It cultivated governors. And when those governors encountered dissent, they didn't respond with violence. That would draw attention. They responded with pathology. Questioners were described as unstable, overly emotional, resistant to progress. The system didn't argue with truth, it diagnosed it. This is one of the oldest tricks in control psychology. Redefine awareness as sickness. Once that frame is accepted, and recognition is the first crack, because the hollowing only works on men who never realize it happened. In the next descent, the mechanism turns inward toward you, toward the ways you were taught to silence yourself without ever being told to be silent. That's where the real confrontation begins. Now, look inside yourself. This is where the story becomes dangerously personal. You were never explicitly taught to silence your voice. No one handed you a rule book labeled how to dull your instincts. Instead, it happened quietly, woven into your upbringing, your education, your culture. The echoes of Black Hollow whisper in the way you learned to manage discomfort, to mask doubt, to prioritize survival over truth. Remember the last time you held back a question, a challenge, or a feeling because it might cause conflict? That hesitation is the legacy of hollowing. It is the internalized lesson that speaking up risks loss, loss of approval, connection, safety. This isn't weakness. It is an adaptation. Feel the weight of that adaptation. How much of your energy is spent navigating invisible boundaries? How many times have you tuned out your intuition because it seemed inconvenient? How often have you told yourself, this isn't the time, it's not worth it, better to stay calm? Each moment you suppress your inner voice, you surrender a piece of sovereignty. This is the paradox Black Hollow created. Freedom sold as safety, obedience disguised as strength. The man who doubts himself first borrows certainty from institutions and eventually becomes a vessel for their control. But here's the critical point. Awareness can reverse this. Recognition that silence is a trained response is the first step to reclaiming voice. Understanding that emotional numbness is not resilience, but a symptom of conditioning, opens the door to rebuilding instinct. Identifying guilt as a tool of control, not a moral compass, restores the power to choose. This is not easy. The process feels like undoing everything you were taught to trust. It means sitting with discomfort rather than fleeing from it. It means confronting voices inside that scream, stay safe while you prepare to be brave. Awakening is not rebellion. It is reclamation. You are not broken for feeling hollowed. You're a product of systems designed to fracture you. But you are not powerless. The men of Black Hollow lost themselves in silence and submission. But you can choose a different path. You can reclaim your name, your history, your reflection. You can reject the narratives imposed on your conscience and rediscover your own. This journey will challenge you. It will unsettle you. It may alienate you, but it will also make you whole. Because true power is born not from obedience, but from self-ownership. And the moment you reclaim your voice, you begin to dissolve the hollow. The question now is simple. Will you? Reclaiming your voice is only the beginning. Because once the silence breaks, the system will fight back, not with chains or violence, but with insidious pressure. It will attempt to pull you back into the hollow, using your own fears and doubts as weapons. This is why awareness alone is not enough. You must build armor. The first layer is vigilance, watching for the subtle signals that you are slipping back into conditioned silence. The moments when self-censorship feels like prudence, when doubt is confused with disloyalty, when discomfort is labeled as weakness. Recognize these traps for what they are. the hollowing process trying to reclaim its hold. The second layer is community. Isolation is the hollow's strongest ally. It thrives when you believe you are alone in your unrest, when your questions feel dangerous or taboo. Seek out those who challenge the system with clarity, who value truth over convenience. Together, your voices create resonance, resistance that cannot be silenced by routine. Third, develop your internal authority. This means cultivating a voice inside that does not rely on external validation or fear of rejection. It means learning to sit with uncertainty without retreating to comfort. It means practicing radical honesty with yourself and others, even when it feels risky. This is the path to true self-mastery. Remember, Black Hollow trained men to replace instinct with guilt and obedience. You must do the opposite. Replace guilt with responsibility. Replace obedience with discernment. Replace silence with purpose. But the battle is ongoing. The hollowing system adapts. It disguises itself as pragmatism, tradition, and loyalty. It whispers that questioning is selfishness, that vulnerability is weakness, that obedience is strength. These lies are the walls of the prison. Your challenge is to see through them, to recognize that the cost of compliance is your very soul, to understand that the deepest power comes from walking into discomfort, speaking uncomfortable truths, and standing firm in your own authority. Because only men who own their voice can dismantle hollow systems. Only men who reclaim their identity can rewrite the rules of power. And only men who choose courage over comfort can awaken the world around them. This is the descent that leads back up, the way out of silence and into strength. But it begins with one decision: to refuse the hollow, to say no to empty obedience, to say yes to yourself. Are you ready? Once you choose to refuse the hollow, the path forward demands fierce clarity. It requires you to dismantle the invisible scripts that have dictated your thoughts, emotions, and actions for years, sometimes decades. These scripts are the quiet architects of compliance, whispering lies disguised as wisdom. You are too sensitive. Don't rock the boat. Keep your head down. Strong men don't question. Each phrase is a thread in the fabric of control, weaving a tapestry that keeps you tethered to a version of yourself that no longer serves. Breaking free means rewriting those scripts, not with shallow slogans, but with deep, unflinching truth. You must confront the fears they've planted. Fear of rejection, failure, conflict, isolation. These are the walls Black Hollow built inside your mind. The silence you once learned to accept as peace was actually a prison. You are being asked to break through these walls, not with force, but with presence. Presence means acknowledging discomfort without fleeing. It means choosing to stand when your instincts scream to run. It means being honest with yourself about the ways you have been hollowed and how that hollowing still influences your choices. This process is exhausting because it demands vulnerability, a state your conditioning tried to outlaw. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the raw soil from which real strength grows. It allows you to reconnect with intuition, passion, and purpose. It awakens the parts of you that were once buried. But breaking scripts is not just an internal battle. It will ripple outward. Relationships, work, and social systems built on your compliance will resist change. Some will push you back into silence with ridicule, dismissal, or subtle manipulation. Others will withdraw, unable to handle your transformation. Prepare for loss. Prepare for isolation. These are the costs of awakening. Yet within these costs lies liberation. Because when you strip away the conditioned layers, what remains is your unfiltered self. This self is not defined by hollowed obedience, but by conscious choice. It is not molded by fear, but by clarity. It does not shrink from truth, it embodies it. Remember, Black Hollow sought to erase this self. The system feared it because it cannot control what it does not understand. Your refusal to be hollowed disrupts the system at its core. And that disruption is the beginning of real power. The next descent will teach you how to wield that power, not as a weapon of control, but as a beacon of freedom. Because true mastery is not domination. It is liberation. And liberation begins with reclaiming the sacred authority of your own voice. With your voice reclaimed, you stand at a crossroads because power is not neutral. It always flows somewhere. The question is, where will yours go? Black Hollow's lesson is stark. Power divorced from self-awareness becomes hollow itself. It perpetuates the cycle of control it once resisted. It replicates the silence it once broke. True power, the kind that reshapes systems and awakens others, begins with humility. Not the hollow humility of submission, but the fierce humility of self-knowledge. This humility requires ruthless self-examination. You must confront the parts of yourself still conditioned to silence, the shadows of fear, guilt, and compliance lurking beneath your surface. These are the weak points that systems exploit to regain control. Recognizing your vulnerabilities is not defeat, it is strength. Because only a man who understands his own fractures can stand firm against manipulation. Only a man who embraces discomfort can lead others through it. And only a man who owns his story can help rewrite the stories that bind his world. Black Hollow's men were taught to erase their past, to sever identity, to obey without question. You're called to the opposite, to integrate your past with your present, to reconcile pain with purpose, to transform obedience into discernment. This is the essence of awakening, not rejecting control entirely, but mastering it within. The world needs men who can wield power without becoming hollow. Men who can resist both external oppression and internal surrender. Men who understand that true authority comes from serving something greater than themselves. Not institutions or ideologies, but timeless principles of truth, integrity, and freedom. Your journey is no longer descending. It is ascent. An ascent forged through the ashes of silence and the fire of self-awareness. This path will test you. It will challenge every belief you hold. It will demand sacrifice, but it will also grant you a gift no hollow system can take: sovereignty over your own mind. Because when a man owns himself, he becomes untouchable, unbreakable, and truly free. The question is no longer whether you can escape the hollow. It is whether you are ready to become the light that shatters it. This transformation, the one that shatters silence and rewrites power, is not an abstract ideal. It is a practical necessity in a world where control systems evolve faster than consciousness. Black Hollow was a 19th century experiment, but its descendants live in every corner of modern life. Corporate cultures that demand conformity, political systems that reward obedience, social networks that shape your thoughts without your knowledge. Recognizing these patterns in your surroundings is the foundation of your defense. Awareness is the flashlight that exposes hidden corridors. Without it, you wander blind, easily guided back in a hollowing. But awareness alone does not suffice. It must be paired with action. Action begins with questioning. Question the rules you've accepted without examination. Question the narratives that comfort you but limit you. Question the loyalties that require your silence. This is dangerous knowledge, not because it leads to chaos, but because it unsettles the comfortable order. The world will resist your questions. Institutions will label you a troublemaker. Friends will misunderstand you. Your own mind will try to silence you with doubts and fears. These are the echoes of black hollow reaching out, trying to pull you back. But here's the secret. Every time you resist the impulse to conform, you reclaim power. Every time you speak truth when silence beckons, you weaken the hollow. You begin to build a new architecture, one founded not on submission, but on sovereignty. A sovereignty that embraces complexity, discomfort, and uncertainty. This sovereignty is not given. It is earned through deliberate struggle. It requires courage to stand alone. It requires persistence to face setbacks. It requires integrity to hold fast when no one else understands. But it also offers freedom, the kind of freedom that does not depend on external validation or permission. It is a freedom that transforms fear into fuel. It turns silence into song, and it creates men who are not hollow vessels, but living beacons. These men reshape history not through domination, but through awakening. They become the catalysts that dismantle control from the inside out. Because the greatest revolution is not overthrowing systems. It is reclaiming the power they stole from you. And that revolution begins with a single choice: to step out of silence, to reclaim your voice, to become unbreakable. The descent into Black Hollow may have started long ago, but your ascent is just beginning. As you stand at the edge of this awakening, you must understand something critical. Systems like Black Hollow do not crumble because of external pressure. They collapse from within when enough men reclaim their voices and refuse to be hollowed any longer. This internal collapse is the most terrifying threat to control because it spreads silently, invisibly, like wildfire under dry leaves. One man's refusal to obey hollow commands inspires another. One man's courage to speak breaks the cycle of silence for many. This is why true rebellion is not loud protests or violent upheavals. It is subtle, relentless, and deeply personal. It is a quiet decision to live authentically in a world that demands conformity. To say no to empty obedience. To say yes to self-mastery. But there is a cost. Reclaiming your voice will fracture relationships built on your previous compliance. Friends, family, and colleagues may resist or reject the change they see in you. They will feel threatened by your refusal to participate in hollow narratives. This is expected. Real transformation is disruptive. You must be prepared to walk alone. But solitude is not the enemy. It is the crucible where your true self is forged. In solitude, you can hear the voices that control trying to be silenced, the instincts that guide rather than bind, the truths that no institution can rewrite. This solitude is also a responsibility, because once you have glimpsed the hollow, you cannot unsee it. You carry the burden of awareness. The choice to act or remain passive is yours. And action begins with small, deliberate steps. Speak when silence is expected. Challenge when obedience is demanded. Hold yourself accountable before systems demand it. These are the foundations of a new power, not imposed from above, but built from within. Remember, Black Hollow succeeded because it shaped men who no longer resisted. You succeed by becoming a man who cannot be reshaped. A man whose voice is his weapon and shield. A man whose presence unsettles hollow systems simply by refusing to conform. This is the true danger of awakening. Not to the system, but to those who rely on your silence. Because once a man owns his voice, he becomes the catalyst for change that no system can control. And that is the legacy you must claim. Not as Viatim, not as a rebel, but as master of your own fate. Your ascent is not just personal. It is the spark that can ignite the collapse of hollow systems everywhere. The question remains, will you answer the call? Now, imagine what happens when many men awaken at once. The ripple effect is profound. Systems designed to maintain control through hollowing face an existential threat. Not from armies or laws, but from a collective refusal to obey silently. This mass awakening cracks open the facade of control. It exposes the contradictions and hypocrisies that once hid beneath ritual and repetition. It reveals the human cost of silence and submission, the lies hollowed out, the potential wasted, the power surrendered. But mass awakening is not spontaneous. It is cultivated through shared experience, dialogue, and courage. It requires men to find one another beyond the noise of conformity, to recognize fellow travelers on the path out of silence, to build networks of authenticity that resist hollowing forces through mutual support. These networks create alternative cultures, spaces where vulnerability is strength, questioning is encouraged, and true leadership is measured by integrity, not obedience. Black Hollow sought to isolate its congregants, cutting them off from the community to deepen control. The antidote is connection. Community becomes resistance. Solidarity becomes a shield. Yet, this collective awakening also demands responsibility. Because a group's power depends on the clarity and intention of its members. Chaos disguised as rebellion only strengthens hollow systems. True resistance requires discipline, self-mastery, the courage to hold space for discomfort and disagreement without fracturing, the wisdom to lead without domination. These are not easy paths, but they are necessary. History will not remember those who passively accept hollowing. It will remember those who dare to reclaim their voices, and through that, reclaim their world. In this light, your individual awakening is part of a larger movement. A movement that challenges centuries of control through silence, that pushes back against systems designed to dull instinct and enforce obedience, that demands a new order, one where men are whole, awake, and sovereign. Your choice to speak and act is a seed in that movement, a seed that, nurtured with courage and truth, can grow into a forest impossible to silence. The descent into Black Hollow taught us what to fear. The ascent teaches us what to become. Strong, unyielding, and alive. Not hollow, but whole. And that is the future you are invited to build. As the awakening spreads, the old narratives begin to crumble. Not because they are loud, but because they no longer hold the weight they once did. The structures built on hollow obedience reveal their fractures. The rituals lose meaning. The language that once enforced silence becomes transparent, hollow itself. Institutions sense this shift. They respond not with openness, but with a tightening grip. More rules, more surveillance, more pressure to conform. This is the reflex of hollow systems when threatened. Escalation. But escalation is a sign of weakness, not strength. It reveals fear, the fear that control is slipping. And this fear can be used as a tool. When systems escalate, they expose themselves. They show where their walls are thinnest. This is your moment. When the pressure mounts, remember, escalation is not power. It is panic. Your refusal to comply becomes a mirror reflecting their instability. Stand firm in your voice. Maintain clarity in your purpose. Resist being drawn into reaction, because true power lies in calm resistance, in the ability to hold space when others demand submission, in the courage to speak when others choose silence. The hollowing method thrives on distraction, on emotional reactivity, on fractured attention. You disrupt it by cultivating focus, by anchoring yourself in your own sovereignty, by recognizing that escalation is the system begging for mercy. You are not the enemy. You are the reckoning, and your power grows with every refusal to be hollowed. But beware the trap of anger. Anger feels righteous, but can become hollow in disguise. When anger dominates, it fractures clarity. It can replicate the very patterns you fight against. Your weapon is not fury. It is discipline, disciplined presence, disciplined speech, disciplined action. These are the tools that dissolve hollow control, that creates new spaces for authentic power. Because power without discipline is chaos, and chaos is exactly what hollow systems crave. So, steel yourself. Prepare for the pressure. Embrace the discomfort, because your resistance, grounded in discipline, is the fulcrum on which change pivots. The descent is a test. Your consent is the answer, and it will reshape everything. As you deepen this journey, understand that the battle against hollow systems is not just external. The fiercest conflict lies within. Black Hollow's greatest triumph was fracturing the self, splitting instinct from intellect, emotion from action, conscience from obedience. Healing this fracture requires more than awareness. It demands integration. Integration means bringing the disowned parts of yourself into the light. The fears you pushed underground, the doubts you silenced, the passions you disguised as weakness. These shadows are not enemies. They are vital signals, messengers pointing toward wholeness. Ignoring them only strengthens the hollow. Embracing them begins reconstruction. This process is neither quick nor comfortable. It requires brutal honesty, a willingness to sit with discomfort without running. It requires patience because parts of you will resist. Conditioning does not release its grip easily. But each moment you choose integration, you reclaim territory lost to hollowing. You rebuild your internal authority. You reconnect mind, body, and spirit. You restore the capacity to act with integrity, not out of compulsion. This internal sovereignty is the foundation of external power. Without it, resistance becomes reactive chaos. With it, resistance becomes deliberate creation. Black Hollow dissolved men into silence. Integration assembles men into voices, and voices form movements. Movements transform cultures. Cultures reshape history. This is the scale of your potential impact. You are not just healing yourself. You are breaking cycles that have spanned centuries. Cycles designed to fragment and control. Cycles that hollow systems depend on. Your commitment to integration is an act of rebellion, not against individuals, but against the invisible forces that seek to silence and conform. This rebellion invites allies, others who refuse hollowing. Together, integration becomes a catalyst, a source of resilience, a foundation for building new systems rooted in authenticity and freedom. The descent into hollowing is deep, but the ascent into integration is deeper. It is the path from fragmentation to wholeness, from silence to voice, from hollow obedience to sovereign power. And it is a path you must choose, one moment, one decision at a time, because every step toward integration weakens the hollow's hold and strengthens the man who walks it. As you move further into this awakening, understand that the transformation you're undergoing does not exist in a vacuum. It ripples outward, affecting not only your internal landscape, but your relationships, your community, and the very structures around you. The men trained by systems like Black Hollow were taught to sever connection, to isolate themselves in silence and submission. Your challenge is to reverse that. True power grows in connection, in a shared vulnerability of honest dialogue and mutual support. But this is difficult. Those around you may resist your change. They may cling tighter to hollow scripts because those scripts provide comfort, predictability, and a false sense of security. When you challenge them, you become a threat, not because you intend harm, but because your awakening exposes their own unspoken fears and silences. This resistance is not personal. It is systemic. The hollow systems defend themselves through social pressure and emotional manipulation. They cultivate conformity by making dissent painful, lonely, and dangerous. Yet, your journey demands courage to face this resistance without retreating. It demands that you create spaces where authentic voices can gather and be heard, communities that nurture growth rather than enforce silence. These spaces are rare, but they're essential. In them, the fractured pieces you integrate find resonance. You discover that your experience is not isolated, but shared. This collective awakening fuels resilience. It disrupts hollow systems not through violence or noise, but through a quiet, persistent refusal to comply with empty obedience. Remember, hollow systems thrive in isolation, division, and silence. Your connection with others is your greatest strength and your most potent form of resistance. But this connection requires honesty, brutal, unfiltered honesty with yourself and those around you. It demands boundaries that protect your sovereignty. It calls for leadership grounded in integrity, empathy, and discipline. The path you walk is not easy. You will face opposition, doubt, and loss. But you will also find solidarity, empowerment, and profound growth. This balance of challenge and support is the crucible in which new power is forged. The awakening man is not merely one who resists hollowing internally, but one who transforms the world around him through connection and courage. Your journey is both deeply personal and profoundly collective. It is the emergence of a new order, one built not on silence and submission, but on voice, sovereignty, and shared strength. The descent was dark and isolating, but the ascent is luminous and expansive. And through it, you become the beacon that shatters the hollow. Now, as you reach this pivotal moment in your journey, understand this final truth. The descent into Black Hollow was never meant to break you. It was meant to prepare you. Prepare yourself to confront the deepest shadows of control, both external and internal, to face the mechanisms that have shaped not only systems, but the very architecture of your mind and soul. This knowledge is dangerous because it unravels illusions that many hold dear about strength, obedience, identity, and freedom. But danger is necessary for transformation. The power you seek lies on the other side of this danger. It is the power to reclaim your story, to rewrite the narratives imposed on you, and to lead others out of silence and submission. This power is not granted by institutions, nor inherited from lineage. It is forged in the fire of self-mastery, awareness, and courageous action. The men who walked Black Hollow were broken to build a system of control. You're being rebuilt to dismantle it. Your voice, your sovereignty, your presence. These are the weapons that hollow systems fear most, because they cannot be regulated, silenced, or controlled once fully awakened. They disrupt the patterns that have persisted for centuries. They expose the invisible chains that bind millions, and they create space for a new order, one rooted in authenticity, integrity, and freedom. But this power comes with responsibility. To hold your voice with discipline, to act with clarity and compassion, to build communities that resist hollowing through connection and truth, to confront not only external systems, but your own shadows with relentless honesty. Your journey is a beacon for those still trapped in silence. Your ascent lights the way through darkness. The hollow will try to pull you back. It will test your resolve. It will whisper doubts and threats. But remember this, you are not alone. Every step you take breaks the cycle. Every voice raised weakens the hollow. Every act of courage builds a new foundation. The choice before you is stark and simple. Continue to live hollowed, fragmented, and controlled, or rise into wholeness, sovereignty, and power. The descent revealed the system. The ascent reveals the man who chooses himself, the man who reclaims his voice, the man who becomes unbreakable. This is your moment. You're called to rise, to lead, to awaken, to become the force that shatters Black Hollow, for yourself, for others, and for the future. The question is not if you will answer. The question is when. And the answer begins now. The silence that once bound you was never your truth. Your voice was always waiting, waiting to rise, to break the hollow, and to reclaim the power no system can take away. This is your awakening. This is your revolution. Speak and be unbreakable.